Okay, hello, welcome back to my video explanations. So this is still topic 4. We're going to look at the military rule in Massachusetts that we've been discussing the whole time, which is a consequence of the Coercive Acts. Now, because of the Coercive Acts and because of the before the Coercive Acts that Samuel Adams set up the committees of correspondence, basically in preparation if Britain were to do anything like they did during the Townshend duties in suspending the colonial governments and bringing in the army. Samuel Adams set up the committees of correspondence to prepare for something like that, and they started to correspond and basically become like almost like little shadow governments behind the scenes. So by the time 1774 rocked around and the Coercive Acts came in and the colonial governments were suspended through the Coercive Acts, basically Massachusetts was placed under military occupation in a way, or military rule. Then these committees of correspondence that were already in place started to take on the role of government behind the scenes that the assemblies used to do, and then they turned into the committees of safety, and then they would eventually become the provincial congresses. So it's basically revolutionary governments forming behind the scenes, and it's basically Britain's coercive acts that makes this happen. So it's a colonial response. Now let's have a look at the military rule. All right. So, military rule in Massachusetts. So martial law. So 1774 with the introduction of the Coercive Acts and into 1775. Now this military rule will go basically all the way until the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which will be in topic 5, which sparks the Revolutionary War. So the shot heard around the world, but we won't look at that until topic 5. But that's when the military rule basically ends, because then the war starts. All right, so this is a painting of Thomas Gage. He's the British military commander of the colonial troops, and at this stage he is in Boston as the military commander. So he's put there as in charge of the British Army and the Coercive Acts, and he's basically becomes the, so to speak, the leader of the military rule in Boston. Now, colonials believed Gage was going to use military force to bring Massachusetts into line. So the atmosphere became explosive. Now, the colonies start to unite behind Massachusetts because they thought what was going on was going against the liberties of American liberties totally, and because of everything that happened before in terms of colonial union, now they go and stand behind Boston because what they thought was going on was unfair and might happen to them next. So they're seeing Britain as being completely tyrannical. Now, reports spread of British troops landing in Boston in their hundreds. Fears that Britain will use military force to control Massachusetts and by extension the other colonies heightened, so exacerbated. If Massachusetts could be dealt with in this way, no colony was secure. So it's better that now that they come together and face Britain united, just like Benjamin Franklin back in the Albany Congress had suggested. Now, the other colonies thus rallied to support Boston, providing food and money to help them. Now, by 1774, many colonists were united by the patriot view that American liberties were under threat by British punitive policies, particularly the Coercive Acts, because of the Coercive Acts. Now, on the streets of Boston, the Sons of Liberty sought to influence people and intimidate those loyal to Britain, so loyalists. And the loyalist view was actually in the minority. Now, generally throughout the colonies, the patriot view was in the majority. Now, it is important to remember that America was not united under one common viewpoint, like we've done in the past, particularly in topic 3, when I explained this, it was patriots versus loyalists. So Americans, most of them were actually patriots, but then a considerable number, about a quarter, were also loyalists. So colonial militias formed, so Minutemen, in response, so during the Coercive Acts. So to be ready at a minute's notice and fight. This is why they're called the Minutemen. All right, so colonial military response. So since the mid-1600s, almost all towns and villages had trained and supported small militias, particularly for their protection from Native Americans, which they called Indians at the time, and the French, but the French are gone, obviously, because of the French-Indian War. Now, militias were poorly armed. They had no uniform. The officers were elected, so they were democratic. Decisions made through consultation, so again, it was democratic, and made up of young and old men. However, they had done regular training. They had done some training, had good shooting skills generally, and knew the countryside and had camaraderie. So a lot of them knew each other because they were from the same towns, they were friends or they were family, so this mattered. Who were the Minutemen? Now, in 1774, in response to the British military rule, the Massachusetts Assembly, now meeting illegally outside Boston through the Committees of Correspondence and Safety and forming into the provincial congresses, ordered a count of militia units around the colony of Massachusetts. Now, in October, they counted 17,000 militiamen. Now, this was a considerable number, but inadequate to defend Massachusetts from an attack by the British. So as a result, an increase in recruits of Minutemen were ordered by the Committees of Safety and the provincial congresses. So Minutemen were to be ready at a minute's notice to fight. This is why they were called Minutemen, as well as improvements to militia organizations and command were ordered. So they're getting organized to maybe resist Britain militarily if they needed to. So in September 1774, you had something called the Powder Alarms. Now, these are a series of war scares. Now, they're war scares. They didn't turn into war, but it almost did. So, powder alarms. Like I said, they're a series of war scares. Now, this tower here is one of the many powder houses in Massachusetts. So powder, gunpowder, which was needed back then, particularly to shoot cannons and also your rifles and your muskets. So Gage, so the British commander, so general, decided he needed to remove all, destroy gunpowder stores scattered throughout Massachusetts in case of the looming armed conflict. It needed to be done in secret to prevent colonists moving their own powder first. So the Committees of Safety were formed for this reason, to monitor British troops and boycott the British goods. So to see more on this topic, see topic 4.1 about the committees. Now, Gage actually makes the first move. One of the first seizures happened in Middlesex County, so in Massachusetts, just an area of Massachusetts called Middlesex, and this was successful. However, Gage, all right, his written instructions were later leaked to the Patriots, who spread the word that Gage intended to disarm the colonies through getting rid of their supply of powder. So, as a result, the Minutemen and the Patriots started to hide their gunpowder supplies. And in response, more men joined the Minutemen, so they became strengthened. And the committees of safety started hoarding arms, so they started building up arms, you know, of weapons and cannons and gunpowder and bullets to be ready for the looming conflict. And express riders were nominated to spread the word to others should the British march on the area. And Paul Revere was one of these riders who you've already met. So this is what's going on, and it's the committees of safety that are basically running this. So the committees of safety are the executive arm of the provincial congresses, which are the revolutionary secret governments. All right, so the tension grows. Now, Gage orders the removal of all the gunpowder from the public stores. Now, thousands of militia, as a result, descend from Massachusetts, from the countryside, on Boston, fearing a war. And small skirmishes between the militia and the troops result, as you can see in these pictures. Small little fighting happens. Now, this increased colonial resentment at the British, and the tension and the growing animosity grows. Now, as the tension mounted, the situation became increasingly volatile. Now, Gage called a halt to the gunpowder seizures and the troop patrols outside of Boston. So he's worried. He's like, "Ooh, I better stop doing this because it's going to turn into war." So he has a moment of calm and thought, and he pulls back, seizing the gunpowder. And then he wrote to London requesting more troops because he sees what's going on. Now, this is a perspective by General Thomas Gage. So he says, quote, "I mean, my lord, to avoid any bloody crisis as long as possible, unless forced into it, which may happen." End quote. So he wants to avoid any crisis with what's happening with the colonial militia. However, he thinks he might be forced into it because he says this may happen. So he's getting ready also that there might be a conflict or even a war. All right, what about rights? Now, the powder alarms again infringed on colonial rights because remember, this is their powder. Now, considered theft of property. Remember, this is Locke, and again, it's infringing on their liberty because Britain is violating their freedom to have these munitions. Now, it's a violation of natural rights like we have discussed. All right. Now, while this is going on, like we've said, through the militia, through the colonial secret shadow governments forming in response to the coercive acts, we basically have the beginning of a revolution now. And in Massachusetts, there's a revolution happening throughout 1774 against Britain, and they're forming their own governments. They're forming their own militias and their own congresses, and in a way, they're becoming quite independent now. All right, so the Massachusetts Revolution. Now, before the start of military conflict at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, which will be our topic 5, 15,000 colonists shut down the Berkshire County Court at Great Barrington on August the 16th. On August the 30th, 3,000 colonists armed with sticks shut down the court in Springfield. This is all throughout Massachusetts. These are all the revolts happening in Massachusetts. On September the 2nd, 4,000 colonists forced the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, so the British one, to resign his seat in cabinet. On September the 6th, 4,600 militiamen from 37 surrounding communities gathered in Worcester to depose Crown-appointed officials, so British officials. Eventually, government apparatus was shut down in Salem, Concord, Barnstable, Taunton, and Plymouth, in every county seat outside Boston. So no county court was allowed to conduct any business under British authority. So basically, throughout all of Massachusetts, there's a successful revolution, except Boston. Boston is under coercive military control by the British. Now, in violation of the Coercive Acts, people continued with their town meetings. So by October, the British had completely lost all political and military control outside of Boston. Now, when the Massachusetts Government Act took effect, so as part of the Coercive Acts, the people of Massachusetts shut down the government and prepared for war through the Committees of Safety. So this is now revolution. Let's have a look at some historical interpretations. All right, so we're going to watch this as well. This is Ray Raphael, who's one of the most notable historians. He's a progressive historian, so he sits on the left of the American Revolution. And he particularly looks at social groups and movements. So, historian Ray Raphael describes the events of 1774 as the most successful uprising in America's history, the only one that removed existing political authority. Now, he argues that the most important of the coercive acts was the Massachusetts Government Act that deprived the people of the power of their votes after a century and a half. So, this eliminated the sovereignty of the people of Massachusetts and threatened their economic solvency because judges were no longer responsible for the people and could be corrupted. So, because the people of Massachusetts basically rebel against having their governments removed, and then they basically have their own revolution and get rid of all of the British authority in Massachusetts except Boston, this act, or their response to this act, is extremely significant. All right, let's watch what Raphael has to say about basically the Massachusetts revolt during 1774.
Worcester, Massachusetts, the shire town or county seat of Worcester County. The date is September 6, 1774. This is 7 months before the American Revolution supposedly began at Lexington and Concord. Now at dawn, militiamen start marching into town. They come from Uxbridge down by the Rhode Island border and from Winchendon up by New Hampshire, from 37 distinct towns. This is literally, by an actual head count, 4,622 militiamen, half the adult male population of the entire sprawling rural county. Now these men are angry. To punish Boston for the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament has just yanked away the charter for all of Massachusetts. For 150 years, people have been gathering in their town meetings to govern themselves on most matters, but now they can't even call a town meeting anymore. They've been exercising some say over the choice of their officials, all the way from the governor's council down to the local sheriffs. But now all these are going to be appointed either directly by the king or by the king's appointed governor. So these people are disenfranchised, and they're rising up as a body to say no way. They are going to close the court, the outpost of British authority in Worcester County. So when 24 court officials show up to work in their dress suits and wigs, and they go up to the courthouse, it's all barricaded, filled with militiamen inside. The town is teeming with militiamen bent on seizing their authority. With nowhere else to go, they retreat to Daniel Haywood's Tavern halfway down Main Street and huddle inside while the militiamen outside decide the formalities of their surrender. So here's what the militiamen decide to do. First of all, they line up on Main Street from Haywood's Tavern up to the courthouse, about 2,300 on each side. And then they usher forth from the tavern one of the officials, and he stands between the lines, and he takes his hat in his hand, and he recites the recantation that he and the other officials have been forced to sign. He says, we cede to the authority of the people. We will never execute the unconstitutional act of the British Parliament that reduces people to arbitrary power. Well, that's a strong recantation, but the problem is only these people heard it. It stretches for a quarter mile, so he has to step forward and say it to the next group. And then to the next group, and over and over and over, 30 times each, over 30 times each. He walks the gauntlet, reciting his recantation, and all the other officials have to do the same thing. And with this dramatic and humiliating display of submission, the courts are closed, and all British authority disappears from Worcester County, never to return. Now, Worcester was not alone. Here's a map from the Massachusetts Historical Society for a few years later. Now, you see all the towns. You're not going to be able to read the names, but look at how many of them. They're everywhere. This is a populated area. Even though it's countryside, it's populated. As a matter of fact, 95% of the population of Massachusetts at this time lives outside of Boston. And everywhere, in all these towns and farming communities, when the court is going to meet, the people swarm on the county seat, the shire town, and they close the court. Everywhere but Boston. Boston, with only 5% of the people, that's the only shire town that doesn't close the court because the British troops are stationed there. But everywhere else, you know, these people close the court and they shed British rule. Now, here's the key. These people are not just protesting. They're not just dumping tea into the harbor. They are actually seizing control of governmental authority. This is the most successful and enduring popular uprising in our nation's history. Now, you'd think that our national narrative would feature it. I mean, the first transfer of authority from the British to the Americans, that's got to be a major event. I mean, any revolution, isn't it an important chapter in any revolution when actually, you know, authority transfers from one side to the other? But it's not featured in our national narrative. It's not even mentioned. Go find it in your textbook. You're not going to find it. It's not there. So here's the big question. Why not? Why don't we tell this story? Who decides what stories we tell and what stories we don't tell? Who's the gatekeeper here anyway? Well, we Americans collectively, we are the gatekeepers. For the past 2 centuries, we've been trapping ourselves inside a narrow national narrative defined by just a handful of iconic themes and events. You know, taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, Boston Massacre, we can recite them by heart. But there was more to it than that. The original historians, the people who wrote histories at the time who actually lived through those times, they told a larger story. They included this Massachusetts Revolution of 1774. But in the 19th century, other stories emerged that whisked it away. The shot heard round the world. You all hear that? Shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord? Well, that phrase was coined by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet and essayist, 60 years later. And now, think of it. If that's the iconic beginning of the revolution, how could there possibly have been a revolution before the revolution? It just hides our story. How about Paul Revere's Ride? Listen, my children, you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Well, that poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 86 years after the fact, on the eve of the Civil War. And look at the basic theme. A lone rider from Boston wakes the sleepy-eyed farmers. Sleepy-eyed farmers? 7 months earlier, you know, they had thrown off British rule, and in the interim, they had, you know, they had armed, they had trained, and they had formed a de facto government, and they were just preparing totally for a counter-revolution that they knew would follow. That counter-revolution did eventually come in Lexington and Concord when the British were trying to retake territory that they had already lost. So why don't we tell this story? Why don't we tell the story of the, you know, why do we choose the Revere stories, the mythological ones, instead of the vital and authentic ones? Why do we do that? Well, for that, we have to get a step deeper yet. We have to actually look at the narrative structures of the narratives, the structural forms of the narratives that we prefer, and what these have to say about revolution. Start with this. We like our stories to have heroes, you know, like the hero does this, and an individual protagonist, and the leaders, and the leaders do it all. But listen, you know, the leader has to drive the story, kind of like the movie we just saw. But where's the leader here? These people won't even accept a leader. They don't take a leader because they are totally democratic. They won't do it. But which is more powerful? A revolution with a leader telling people what to do, or a revolution where the people are rising up and commanding their own revolution? Okay, we like our stories with a clear plot line. You know, the revolution starts here and spreads to here, and then climaxes here. But where's the revolution? Where's the plot line in our story? It's like erupting everywhere. But which is a stronger revolution? The one that has a nice tidy line, or the one that erupts and is just all over the place? We like our stories with some blood and guts. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. Well, this one didn't bleed. And why didn't it bleed? Because if you have 90% of the people on one side, as we did in this revolution, and only 10% on the other, you're not going to find a lot of resistance. But on the other hand, if you had more like a 60-40 split, well, then you'd have resistance. You'd probably have some bloodshed, and then you'd tell the big story of the revolution. But that's not a strong revolution. That's more like a civil war. The real revolution, the overpowering revolution, is where you have everybody joining in, the 90%, you know, and that's a stronger story. Finally, and here's a story we love to tell. It's a feel-good story. Tiny little David, the colonials, the outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned colonials, best mighty Goliath, the strongest British Empire, on the earth. We love to tell that story. But now look at Worcester. How do you tell that story in Worcester? The 4,622 militiamen, these people are David, and those 20 court officials huddling in the tavern are Goliath. You see, it just doesn't fit. And if your story doesn't fit the narrative form, it doesn't get told, right? So let me leave you with this. Beyond the Massachusetts Revolution of 1774, beyond the distortions to the nature of revolution, beyond, and actually extending outwards to all our historical renderings, the way we tell history, beware of pat narrative forms and reruns of the same iconic stories, because these can hide more than they reveal.
Okay. So that leads us to the first Continental Congress, which we will look at next time. All right. I hope you enjoyed Raphael. He's a very significant and revisionist historian. Okay, so cheerio.